Thick, greenish-brown clouds roiled in the sky outside the glass dome that enclosed our world. The clouds, tinted a sickening hue from years of lingering radioactive particles, moved with ominous languor, like a beast prowling, reminding us of the danger that lay just beyond our protective walls. Once, our ancestors had roamed free under blue skies, taking the sun's warmth for granted. But we had squandered that privilege. A catastrophic war, a devastating flurry of nuclear weapons rendered the surface toxic. Now our days were spent watching the swirling atmosphere that threatened to consume us if we dared venture outside without protective suits. Inside the biodome, life followed rigid rules. Every resource was measured, every drop of water and gulp of filtered air rationed. Our city was divided into quadrants containing prefabricated housing shells of metal and reinforced plastic. Crops were grown in artificially lit greenhouses, using every ounce of nutrient we could extract from the contaminated soil. Even the wind turbines installed atop the dome hummed at all hours, harnessing the minimal breezes filtered through giant vents. The hum was as constant as our breathing, an ever-present reminder of the precarious balance in which we lived. My father had once told me stories of a time before we constructed these domes. In old photographs, he showed me sprawling fields, real grass, and open-air cities with broad streets. Even as a child, I found it hard to believe in such a vibrant past, since I had only known the stinging odor of decontamination fluid and rows of rubber boots lined at the entrance to every building. When I was much younger, I had snuck out of our residential block to a narrow walkway that led up to one of the dome's maintenance platforms. Through a round window, I could see an endless field of beige and gray beyond the protective glass. That had been my first glimpse of the outside. I could still recall the dryness in my throat, as though I had inhaled ash. In some ways, seeing the world beyond our safe bubble was more terrifying than all the stories combined. Population control came into effect around the time the first biodome was constructed. Officials from the High Council concluded that resources could only support a limited number of citizens. Each birth had to be approved, each pregnancy meticulously planned. Violators faced exile, certain death in the radioactive storms. My parents had told me they struggled for months to receive approval to have me. My father showed me the documents stamped with red ink that sealed my allowed existence. A child in the biodome was not simply a child. We were investments, the future workforce necessary to keep the city functioning. Yet in that coldly logical approach there was security. Only a slight chance existed of severe famine or catastrophic meltdown inside the dome. The system, strict and unforgiving, supposedly kept us alive. Over time, splinters of rebellious thought emerged among the younger generation, myself included. We felt trapped, not only by the dome but by the laws that governed every moment of our lives. As soon as I was old enough, I spent hours reading old journals about how the council formed. In a time of crisis, the council had absolute authority. To preserve our species, all sorts of personal freedoms were curtailed. No one seemed to question it. Or at least not publicly. Yet behind closed doors, rumors flourished, tales that the High Council had found a way to manipulate the population in more subtle ways. Culling, forced sterilizations, or orchestrated accidents were whispered about, though never proven. The older generation, taught to be grateful that we survived the cataclysm at all, refused to harbor such suspicions. I didn't share their complacency. My father worked as an engineer in the main greenhouse sector, coaxing stunted vegetables to grow in nutrient-laden containers. Over the years, the greenhouse expanded upward, tier by tier, as we devised new ways to use the interior space of the dome more efficiently. We had to adapt quickly because the radiation storms outside seemed to intensify, creeping closer and threatening the structural integrity of the enclosure. Lately, the High Council repeatedly warned us that the storms could breach the outer walls if we didn't reduce our waste of resources. They hammered home the notion that population control was the only method to manage risk. Beyond the walls, uncontrolled survivors supposedly roamed the wasteland in tattered suits, short-lived wanderers who might last a few days or perhaps a year before succumbing to the radioactive air. We never could confirm their fates. Each morning I'd join my father in the greenhouse, scanning the leaves of genetically modified plants that were meant to yield multiple harvests. The humidity inside the greenhouse was stifling, but it smelled 1,000 times better than the musty corners of the living quarters that so many families packed themselves into. One morning we found that a new variety of tomato we had painstakingly bred had developed translucent spots on several leaves. Dad frowned, telling me those spots indicated a possible contamination or a deficiency in the nutrient mix. If it was contamination, the entire row of plants might have to be destroyed. We couldn't take chances. The risk of letting mutated seeds spread was too high. We radioed the control room to warn them and then yanked out every questionable plant. I watched, my heart heavy, as Dad painstakingly sealed the remains in a barrel for incineration, a small reminder of how frail our living system was. Outside, the swirling radiation pressed against the dome like a living shadow. When I wasn't in the greenhouse, I'd slip away to the old library sector. It was more archive than library, dust and darkness enveloping rows of battered shelves. But it was my refuge. One rainy afternoon, if you could call the toxic drizzle outside rain, I discovered a device described as a Geiger counter from centuries ago, used to measure radioactivity. It was an outdated piece that had been superseded by more modern scanning tech, but something about it fascinated me. History, it seemed, was the only way to truly understand how we had gotten here. When I brought the Geiger counter home, Dad gave me a warning look. "You know you can get in trouble taking old relics from the archive," he said, "especially if the council thinks it's not meant for public hands." But he didn't order me to discard it. He understood my curiosity. Perhaps a small part of him still believed in passing on the knowledge that had kept him and our ancestors alive. Besides, he'd noticed a strange phenomenon in the greenhouse. Localized spikes in radiation levels that didn't seem to correlate with any external changes. He wanted me to test our environment, hoping to find an explanation. Working discreetly, we used the ancient Geiger counter to take readings around the greenhouse, expecting to see minimal fluctuations filtered through the dome's protective fields. However, a few corners showed slight but abnormal increases in those ominous clicks. As the days passed, the High Council announced that the radiation storms were intensifying. Apparently, the swirling clouds outside gathered more radioactive elements from across the planet, forming a superstorm that threatened to converge directly over our biodome. Rationing became even stricter, and the council mandated that each family submit a daily log of water and energy consumption. Unease settled over the city. We all felt it. Nightly announcements reminded us to obey the population controls, to not hide pregnancies or house unauthorized individuals. A rumor spread that a group of outsiders, even more heavily mutated from the radioactive wind's head, tried to breach the dome in a desperate attempt to survive. The council denied these claims, but tension rose nonetheless. During one such announcement, I noticed the council's representative mention a plan called optimal occupancy readjustment. The phrase was cold, clinical, and I suspected it meant forced evictions, or worse. For years, there had been an unspoken idea that the dome had almost reached its carrying capacity. Expanding it was nearly impossible. The outer plating was expensive to produce and required materials we no longer had. Even scavenging for salvage was a risky venture, though teams occasionally left the dome in pressurized suits to gather what they could from the ruins of old cities. The reality was grim. If the superstorm arrived, the council might decide we had too many people leaching precious oxygen and water. Around that same time, food rations decreased drastically under the guise of emergency measures. People waited in line at ration stations for hours, only to receive a smaller portion than before. We began to see the effect in the greenhouse. Anxiety made workers clumsy with the delicate plants, some of which were already struggling from the mysterious radiation spikes Dad and I had recorded. Meanwhile, we started noticing suspicious absences. Families with a second child quietly vanished, replaced by newly vacated living spaces. Most inhabitants simply accepted the official story that those families had embarked on special missions or been relocated. I feared something far darker, that they had been purged to reduce the population ahead of the storm. Dad confronted his supervisor at the greenhouse, a stoic man named Kiro. Kiro deflected questions, insisting the missing families had been reassigned to another sector. Yet Kiro's eyes betrayed him, a flicker of sympathy or guilt. When Dad pressed further, Kiro gave him a coded tip. If you want to protect yourself and your family, get your medical clearance in order. After that cryptic exchange, Dad confided in me. He believed the council intended to implement a cull, a selective elimination of those deemed less vital to the dome's survival. When I next visited the library archive, I found it locked down. A stern guard posted at the entrance told me the council had confiscated certain documents for safekeeping. He demanded I hand over my library pass. I felt a pulse of dread as I slipped the laminated pass into his outstretched hand. He scanned it through a small device that beeped ominously. Don't wander, he said. It's for your own protection. The door hissed shut behind him, sealing off what knowledge remained from our city's early days. Undeterred, I set out to find others who had begun piecing together the truth. I discovered a handful of like-minded individuals, some greenhouse workers, a couple of medics, and a friend in the sanitation department who'd noticed an uptick in the incineration of personal belongings. Our hunch was that the High Council had perfected a method of tracking families with questionable productivity or who risked having unauthorized offspring. Once targeted, they'd vanish. The simple fact was that for every few people who disappeared, rations got slightly easier to distribute, so few asked questions. It was a chilling system that leaned on fear, follow the rules, or face banishment. In secret gatherings, we discussed the unthinkable, leaving the biodome before the cull could reach us. Could we survive outside? Clothed in the old protective suits from salvage runs, we might buy ourselves time, but to what end? The surface was awash in radiation storms, the air thick with toxins. If no other dome existed, we'd be walking towards certain death. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only alternative to being systematically removed by the council. One evening, Dad came home with his face ashen. He had discovered that his employee ID no longer granted him access to certain greenhouse levels. Moreover, Kiro implied that Dad's productivity had been labeled below standard. Something was happening, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I also became a target. We were both determined to stay ahead of the High Council's net. Under cover of darkness, we sneaked into an older section of the dome that had been sealed off due to a structural imperfection. There, Dad remembered a small service exit that was used in the early days for material intake. The corridor leading to it was narrow, lined with metal crates and centuries-old filtration units, all plastered with the council's defective discard stamp. The air smelled of stagnant water. At the end of that corridor, the door was, as expected, locked tight with an electronic seal. We stared at it, uncertain of our next move. Then Dad noticed a panel overhead, partially unscrewed. He clambered up on a crate and removed it, revealing a dusty control interface. The system was outdated, but Dad, an engineer at heart, recognized some of the wiring. He plucked at the wires, bypassing the security circuit. Miraculously, the door slid open a fraction before jamming. A savage blast of hissing air seeped in from outside, and we quickly realized the external door was also damaged, letting in trace amounts of contaminated air. We panicked, fumbling for our respirator masks. The digital readout on Dad's wrist beeped, radiation levels spiking. We scrambled to reseal the door and retreated, coughing from the sudden, acrid stench. Returning to our cramped living quarters, we realized how close we had come to lethal exposure. After scanning ourselves, we found the dose we'd received was small but definitely more than advisable. That night, sleep evaded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw roiling clouds and felt them pressing on our flimsy walls, waiting for any crack to flood our lungs with poison. I was torn between hoping we could eventually fix that door and slip away, or resigning myself to the slow suffocation within the dome's oppressive laws. The next afternoon, we discovered that the High Council had begun rounding up workers from the greenhouse, including Dad. After my morning shift, I returned to find the greenhouse deserted, except for armed council enforcers. They held guns that fired tranquilizing darts. My heart seized as I hid among rows of dwarf bean sprouts. Through the gaps in the leaves, I saw my father with his hands raised, forcibly escorted out by two enforcers in white hazard suits. They led him toward a ground vehicle parked inside the dome. A faint crackle from the vehicle's loudspeaker announced that greenhouse operations were temporarily suspended. Nobody was allowed in or out until the space was cleared. Once Father and the others were forced into the vehicle, I watched it speed off, leaving me trembling with fury and helplessness. I slipped away via a side corridor, stealing glances at patrolling enforcers. The rumor of a cull was apparently more than rumor. This was the beginning. With Father gone, I had to act fast. I thought of the handful of allies we'd assembled. I had to warn them before they, too, were captured. First, I found Lena, a medic at the main clinic who'd suspected the Council's sinister activities. She was sifting through a pile of confiscated medical records when I burst into her office. Her face blanched at the sight of me. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "They're looking everywhere." "Then we need to leave," I said, voice quivering with desperation. "They've taken my father. They'll come for you next. Anyone who might stand in their way." My words tumbled over each other, a frantic plea. Lena nodded, face tight with resolve. She had suspected this day would come. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small black bag. Inside were half a dozen vials of anti-radiation medication and syringes. "I keep these for emergencies," she whispered. "There's enough to give us a chance outside for at least a few days." We set off to gather whatever supplies we could. Lena had a contact in sanitation, Rico, who had a spare set of hazard suits hidden away. We found him in a cluttered storage area. He handed us the suits in silence, avoiding eye contact. His hands trembled. "When the time comes, use these," he said, voice hushed. I suspected he was too terrified to join us, worried about the hazards beyond the dome. Or perhaps he had family obligations. We thanked him and left, aware that we had to move quickly. Our plan was to fix the old service exit. We needed to repair the external door so the contaminated air wouldn't seep in. Once it was sealed, we could open it properly. We returned to the same corridor Dad and I had discovered. Standing on the same crate, I popped open the control interface while Lena held up a weak flashlight. We worked for a tense hour, splicing wires and carefully aligning the circuit. Then, with a faint hiss, the door slid open again, more cleanly this time. The air inside the small entry chamber was stale, but not heavily contaminated. We stepped in, the door closing behind us with a metallic clang, leaving us enveloped in darkness. A second door led outside. Before we could don our suits and venture out, we heard a muffled commotion from inside the corridor. Lights flickered, and I heard footsteps echoing. I froze, heart pounding. We quickly sealed the door from our side, whispering to each other, hoping that the jammed interface would buy us time. The footsteps paused, then a voice barked an order. I recognized Kiro's voice. "Open this door, or we'll have to force it." A swirl of dread and relief overcame me at the same time. Why was Kiro here, not a team of enforcers? Did that mean we had a chance to reason with him? "Stay quiet," Lena urged, but something inside me stirred, a desperate desire for answers. Through a small slit in the door, I could see Kiro motioning behind him. "The Council has Father," I hissed. "They're probably forcing him to help track me down." Lena nodded anxiously, her expression torn. She placed a hand on my shoulder, urging me to remain silent. We had come too far to risk capture now. We activated the mechanism to open the external door, our hazard suits half clipped on. A wave of dust-laden wind hit us like a physical blow. My eyes stung and my suit visor fogged for a moment before the suit's miniature fans cleared it. Lena stumbled behind me, gripping my arm. The landscape was undulating with debris, scraps of concrete, twisted rebar, and dunes of gray dust. We stepped farther out until the dome was behind us, a curved silhouette against the raging sky. Our suit's monitors began ticking. Even with the protective layering, we were not meant to linger in such concentrated radiation indefinitely. We trudged forward, hearts pounding in time with the roar of the wind. It was like walking across a desolate moon. Grains of dust pelted our visors, occasionally obscuring our vision. I was under no illusion that this was safer than the dome, but we were free from the Council's immediate grasp. After a few minutes, we angled sideways, looking for an outcropping of rock or a section of collapsed structure for shelter. Beyond a twisted highway overpass, we found the partial remains of an old building that formed a shallow, cave-like opening. We squeezed inside, breathing heavily. The Geiger counters beeped incessantly, warning us of the radiation swirling outside. We each pulled out a syringe of Lena's anti-radiation medication, injecting it through the suit's sealed port. We agreed to wait there, gather our bearings, check our suits for leaks. One tear, and we'd be lethal sponges for the radioactive dust. The day wore on, though the gloom of the clouds made it difficult to track time. Eventually, in the distance, we spotted a shape bobbing through the haze. A creature, or perhaps a person. We crouched low, hearts pounding, rational minds unable to guess what finds one might encounter in this wasteland. It drew closer. A figure clad in a patched hazard suit. The suit was battered, likely salvaged from multiple sources, but it was intact enough to keep its wearer alive. They lurched forward awkwardly, carrying a staff that looked more for balance than combat. We remained silent, unsure if this figure was friend or foe. Then I remembered the rumors of roving survivors, mutated or simply desperate. The person's visor angled our way, as if noticing us. They paused. For a moment I thought they might flee. My palm tightened around a small knife I carried for emergencies. Then came a faint shout, hoarse and muffled by the wind. "Help! Help me!" Lena squeezed my arm. She gestured that we should offer what assistance we could. If we were going to survive outside the dome, forging an alliance might be our best hope. We emerged cautiously. At a closer distance, I saw that the figure was older than I expected, with silver hair escaping beneath the suit's rim. Their visor was scratched, nearly opaque, but the voice was resolute. "There are more of us. Further out. We have some supplies." A swirl of dust momentarily separated us. "If you have medicine, please," they pleaded. "Some of my people are sick. We risk traveling closer to your dome, hoping for help." Lena and I exchanged a glance. We had precious little medication, though arguably more than we'd need for just the two of us. But how many more were out there? Did they have resources we lacked? In that tense moment, I felt the weight of choice pressing on my chest. The dome had taught me that every decision had consequences, yet I thought of my father and the injustice done to him. Perhaps it was time to create a different kind of community, even if building it in this desolate place seemed impossible. Slowly, I extended one of the vials we'd carried. The silver-hailed stranger accepted it with trembling hands. They beckoned for us to follow, explaining that their camp wasn't far. They claimed to have a small generator and improvised lead shielding. On the journey, Lena and I exchanged uneasy glances, half expecting an ambush. But the reality was sadder, just a dozen people, living in a makeshift bunker, composed of scavenged cargo containers. Many of them were gaunt, and the old patchwork suits they wore had likely allowed countless small doses of radiation to seep through. They perked up when they saw our vials of medicine. We distributed what we could, mindful to keep a dose or two for ourselves. In return, the group offered us food rations, scans of ancient vegetables, accompanied by filtered water. We huddled around a battery-powered heater, ignoring its weak output, but grateful for the slight warmth. That night, while dust-laden winds howled outside, I learned more of their story. Years ago, some had been expelled from biodomes for violating population laws. Others had never lived in a dome to begin with, surviving on cunning, trade, and luck. They believed there were other pockets of survivors, small enclaves scattered across the globe, constantly migrating in search of less toxic terrain. When I asked if they'd consider trying to get into the dome, they shook their head. "We'd die if we tried," said the silver-hailed individual, "and you'd likely face punishment for harboring us." I bit my lip, stung by the truth of this statement. The dome was no longer a bastion of hope for me anyway. I remembered how the High Council had seized my father, how the cull was in full swing. At dawn, or what we assumed was dawn, I walked outside the bunker and saw the swirling sky tinted red by the sun's hidden rays. My suit's Geiger counter was still ticking, but slower than before. Lena joined me, quietly remarking that the superstorm might be passing on. Perhaps the worst of the swirling clouds had drifted elsewhere. Her voice choked up when she mentioned that if the superstorm was waning, the dome might remain intact, continuing its brutal version of order. That left my father's fate uncertain. Still, with the ragtag community at my side, a new vision took shape, forging a place beyond the council's tyranny. a settlement that harnessed each other's skills to eke out survival. It was a grand dream, maybe foolish, but the only alternative I had left was despair. We gathered supplies, torn tarps, metal scraps, anything that could be repurposed into a more stable living environment. Perhaps we could find lead-lined rooms in the buried remains of once great cities to expand the camp. Joining scattered clusters of humanity, we might slowly piece together a future. Radiation levels would remain a constant threat, the clock always ticking, but at least we'd be free to decide our own fates. In the hush that followed, I let my eyes drift to the horizon. The dome stood in the distance, a looming, curved silhouette, a relic of our failures and our desperate desire to stay alive. Inside that bubble, alarm bells were likely sounding, warnings about the population's viability. Perhaps the High Council was already reporting a successful readjustment. Perhaps Father was still breathing, or maybe dragged away as part of the cull. My heart twisted at the thought of him locked in some subterranean cell. But I couldn't go back, not without losing my only chance at real freedom. Behind me, Lena and the silver-haired survivor began discussing the rationing of water filters. I caught snippets of their conversation, something about combining resources to get a stronger purifier. These were the first fragile threads of belonging that I'd felt in a long time. Gazing at the battered suits and hopeful faces, I knew our new life would be a constant struggle. Every day, radiation would threaten to poison our cells, and the storms could shift unpredictably. But out there, with the battered remnants of humanity, I felt a spark of possibility. The biodome's promise of safety was built on oppression, illusions, and cold calculations. Out here, maybe real hope could still take root among the ruins. I inhaled, letting the harsh wind fill my lungs through the filter. We would keep moving, keep searching for safer ground, better shielding, or even other groups that might join us. I thought of Dad's words. If there's one thing humankind knows how to do, it's adapt. Perhaps one day, we'd gather enough resources and knowledge to rescue those trapped within the dome's glass walls. Or perhaps we'd build a new settlement so compelling that future generations would choose it over the Council's rule. In the distance, lightning threaded through the toxic clouds, an eerie greenish flash splitting the sky. The wind's moan gathered in intensity, carrying the memory of 1,000 ruins. The radiation clock was still ticking, but I felt my resolve solidify. For the first time, I didn't see the swirling clouds as a barrier. They were a warning, but also a call to find a better path. My father's sacrifice, our flight from the dome, the desperate offers of help from this small band, it all demanded that we push on. With that, I turned away from the dome's silhouette and stepped toward the unknown. The future would be shaped by those willing to brave the storm rather than remain locked in the illusions of safety. And though our legs were unsteady, our hearts beat as one.